Okay, hello. This is episode 61 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. It's been a couple of months since the last one.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, looks like it was 2 months ago. Um, so we'll take a look at some changes to the draft of the second piece, which was involved with posting our own hits on Mechanical Turk, and then looking at those results in a context of readability, which was a concept that came out of the first paper, the first study. So that's the gist of what we'll be doing. We might then just talk about a couple of potentially useful resources. I think that's most everything. Am I skipping over something?
No, that's the plan.
Okay. All right. Well, did you want to talk about changes to the
Yeah,
draft?
let me pull it up. I can screen share, correct?
You should be able to.
Okay, let me get this up real quick. Yeah, so I build it. While I pull this up, hold on, there we go. Worked in the stuff on Engel's Taskscape, which I used to kind of draw out the notion of the task and setting it up in lieu of the literacy stuff that we originally had in there, as a way of connecting it, and then sort of laying the groundwork for a discussion of the rhetorical situation as potentially way of connecting it back up to rhetoric. And I did that, so all the methods section had been where we previously discussed the Ong, Ulmer, Homovec stuff. And so my instinct was not to replace the Taskscape stuff in method, but to put it in the introduction. Because I thought it flowed well from the earlier part of the introduction that was talking about how AI is generally treated. And so expanding it out. So like, here's the general way in which readability can be approached. And then the telling stuff. So, this paragraph ends with forms of readability are complicated. They collapse physiology and intellect. They invoke human aspects beyond semantic content. This aligns with our project's first study. The first study used aggregate text mining to identify readability as an aspect of what's called telling. Human actors acting as censors. And so building on that then is when I plugged in the stuff on the Taskscape, building from basically, we're kind of following the notion of a human intelligence task and sort of queuing in on that notion of task and the Taskscape. And so then I give a brief block quote from Ingold. I'll smooth this and add some more framing. But basically, the idea of what the Taskscape, and this is one thing we can discuss too, is introduction versus method, because I kind of describe it as a, it's kind of a conceptual, as I write here, right? The Taskscape is a conceptual apparatus, right? Like it helps, the notion of a Taskscape helps us, zero in on all the ways in which, so when we get into the method, basically the way I imagined it is this notion of a Taskscape here then lays out, right, which is, I dropped a little bit in here, is this, it highlights how right, readability emerges within a particular Taskscape, right? It's not this discrete act that's brought wholesale into various tasks, but the task is part of generating whatever readability is. And so I think that makes sense then for describing our method, because our method is essentially taking part in the Taskscape, but also arranging a particular Taskscape to see what forms of readability it generates.
Yeah.
yeah, and then at the end of this, right, so rather than treating readability as a discrete and stable capacity, and probably a pre-existing one, right, and that will go back to at least the kind of the way in which we sort of name check Plato, right, this kind of discrete pure form of readability. A move to Taskcape allows us both to complicate readability, so that kind of the first thing it helps us do, right? It helps us sort of complicate, think about readability, and it gives us purchase on the generative dynamic of the MemTurk platform itself. So that Taskcape is a way to think about how readability emerges within a particular assemblage of stuff. But the notion of Taskcape is also useful methodologically to figure out how to go about doing that, because essentially what we're doing in the method section, what we did for this part of the project is create a Taskcape designed to explore what readability might emerge. And then this last part, our emphasis on the Taskcape of readability helps us furthermore in place our work within an ongoing and vital conversation rhetorical theory, the ever-emergent theorizing of the rhetorical situation. In the discussion section, we'll ask how much of our tracing of readability through Turks itself theorizes the rhetorical situation. And then I dropped in a quick, right, so our deployment of Taskcape resonates, for instance, with Thomas Rickart's employment of ambience. I'll probably need to explain more there. The reason I dropped this in is because in the first draft of, and then we can get here's, you can see how I kind of started lacing it into the discussion section. But kind of ends with this need not be bleak technology. So kind of talking about, right, the way in which, right, once you move beyond this as a discrete human capacity that human beings are in demonstrable control of, right? So this need not be bleak. Anthropologists and cognitive scientists, including Andy Clark, have suggested that we've always been entangled with technologies, and these partnerships have proved largely beneficial. So that's where I thought I would again return to the Taskcape, because one of the things that Ingold points out is that the Taskcape isn't a sort of pre-existing Taskcape, right? That the Taskcape is only constituted insofar as various elements are participating in it. So it's not a kind of deterministic or reductive model. It's not insofar as, right, the Taskcape actually shapes the bodies that are in it, but only insofar as those bodies are participating in it. So it's this much more, right, rhetorical, negotiated kind of thing. So then that then led me into, and this I have to add more, but a brief tracing of the rhetorical situation,
Right.
But then building up that Rickart's notion of, right, that Kairos wills us and Logos speaks us only insofar as we're speaking, right? And so the notion of the Taskcape also suggests an attendance to Taskcape is potentially a way, even though we're not, right, we're trying to really explore what the platform does and how it operates and the ways in which it's theorizing human intelligence and task, that if folks are thinking about, right, then is it just, I can't think of the word. Anyway, the notion of a Taskcape like rhetorical situation gives us purchase not just into like studying it or making sense of it, but potentially changing it or altering it, or, right, that there's a sense in which this is an ongoing process. Then there's ways to tweak it in ways that people might find, amelioratory or that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and I kind of lost the thread of, because like the conclusion, I believe we were discussing ways that this was going to shape the conclusion, that then feeds into
yeah.
But I can't quite remember. I'm looking through my notes to see in what ways. it's one of the difficulties of the big gap. In what ways might this shape the conclusion?
And that's it, right? Was then how the taskscape leads into right, that the notion of the taskscape being this kind of generative process in which bodies are shaped and capacitated, that would then lead to, right, that this notion of various taskscapes create the conditions for the emergence of certain kinds of intelligence, would then lead us to explore right now the kind of cultural technique thing that could potentially allow us to not move beyond mechanical Turks, but to place mechanical Turks as this kind of cultural technique that,
Right.
but the taskscape was kind of a way to both make sense of what we found within that task that we generated, but then the notion of a taskscape as a kind of generative process, right? That doesn't just, right, a taskscape isn't just employing readability, but it's also constituting what readability is. Then cultural techniques, I think, going forward is what then allows us to draw that out and then start thinking about mechanical Turks in terms of some of these larger theoretical questions that would link it back to some other things that we talked about. I'm thinking
Yeah.
with, particularly with Casey and Jim early on. So it may be that this stuff that I've added on to the end of the discussion section might be better off in the conclusion section.
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends in terms of how it's potentially setting up what comes after.
Yeah.
The degree to which, because I mean, like, it seems like a lot of this would go here in terms of a recap of the situation.
Yeah.
Discussion, but I mean, the conclusion might then be a turn in terms of, so what does that mean going forward? Or what's the, what do we do with that? If this is a contribution to the discourse on situation, where then does it go from here?
Yeah. Well, I wonder if that's, I mean, potentially one of the things we talked about earlier too is linking the taskscape to the rhetorical situation and then using the notion of cultural techniques as a way to flesh out rhetorical situations that include, the non-human and also complicate the human. So insofar as, right, that there's, as we go back to this conversation, there is, particularly Bitzer's, the kind of first instantiation of it, right, is this very much objective external exigence,
right,
that entirely shapes the rhetor. And then, right, Vatz comes in and says, no, it's the rhetor's makes it salient by attending to it. That in many ways, if I had to pick, right, if I couldn't meet, I would pick Bitzer, because I find Bitzer more amenable to a kind of new materialist post-human perspective, wherein the elements of the rhetorical situation shape it, right? It isn't just for the rhetor to pick up and, right, I find the sort of humanist social constructionism of Vatz much less appealing than Bitzer's model, where he even lists out, right, here's all the right, he's treating them in a kind of Platonic objective sense, right? But his rhetorical situation is full of non-human shit, right? He just doesn't see it as also dynamic and emergent and, right, that
and comparable.
Right. So I'm wondering if this outline of the taskscape and then bringing in notions of cultural technique are a way to kind of, refashion a way of thinking about how
Yeah.
the human emerges.
Yeah.
And that could be potentially the pivot from this to that, right? That we're
Well, and maybe,
we're neo-Bitserians.
well, yeah, maybe even that discussion or that conversation is part of the conclusion that, it's unsurprisingly, it's not the same as what came before, but it rhymes with it in the sense of,
Yeah.
Bitzer gives credence to non-human elements, but it is a very kind of Platonic notion of things. In fact, it's not too far from at least what I was trying to discuss in your collection about posthumanism. That posthumanism still has a strong strain of Platonism, which is like, the cyborg is me plus
right
material augmentations, but it doesn't give sort of full credence to that being an equal partnership. It's just sort of like they're subservient material things that make us more than human, right? Post-human being like just like more of it. But I mean, maybe a discussion there of, recapping the kind of, or reiterating the kind of materialism in Bitzer, but in a way that attends to not only their materialism's fluidity, but its status, its contemporary status and position.
Well, and that would really make sense because, right, this is sort of the nest of that whole term, is that Bitzer is more useful if you take his sort of litany of human and non-human components of rhetorical situation, and then do the kind of move that Ed Bauer and Rickert do, particularly Ed Bauer's like, this is not the rhetorical situation, right, suggests a kind of discrete container. And then once you imagine, so if you then imagine a much more ecological or ambient reading of Bitzer, then it starts to become much more amenable to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, right, then it goes back to Clark, who uses language of merger, right? Clark very much sees these things as not, even already uses and takes part in the kind of cyborg language. He sees these things as much more mutual, and right, he uses merger, right, terms it suggests, right?
Yeah.
We're capacitated by these things, right? We're not just
right. I mean, his interpretation of the human seems to incorporate the non-human anyway. I mean, it's like, the definition of human hinges on its incorporation of things that are not itself.
Yeah, and even, there's still one of my favorite parts. Well, not one. It's increased. It's now one of my favorite parts of Clark is when he's sort of making a defense of his notion of the kind of extended mind.
Right.
Where will someone say, well, if it's not there, then it's here, and then he says, okay, well, let's go the other way around. Where, if it's inside, where is it inside?
Right.
And then he basically says, well, that's just, it ends up just nihilistic. Right, you keep going further and further until there's nothing, which is kind of, I think, really interesting. Right, the further you retreat into the human, you end up finding nothing, which which seems to be even less preferable, even for a humanist.
That's that's an interesting critique of Platonism, because at least as commonly understood, Plato sets up pretty hard partitions. I mean, this is, if nowhere else, you can see it in his Screed Against Writing, right? I mean, where he's pretty clearly saying, no, there's, a human ability and there's this other thing. And in fact, that other thing weakens our essential humanity because it makes us dependent on it, right? I mean, and that is complicated if you go inward. I mean, because it leads to an infinite inward regress where it's like, yeah, but Plato, you didn't invent the language you use. So does that mean you can't think in language? Or, I mean,
right.
If you want to be biological, it's like, okay, well, was it this neuron? No.
Right.
Was
that's
it this
basically
neuron?
what Clark does is, okay, now show me
Right.
where inside. Yeah, it's an infinite regress in either direction.
Right. Now, I mean, you can forward answers to that, but they're all not arbitrary, but certainly interested, right? I mean, you could say, well, no, it's this brain region. I mean, we do that now. I'm left-brained, which is me, right? But people do it. Or, I mean, as educators, I don't know what to do with this. People are like, well, I'm a visual learner. And I'm like, that is not a thing. That was just a made up BS framework. And if you believe in research, the research into that is at best very mixed.
Yeah. But here's some PowerPoint slides, kid.
Yeah. Or, I mean, you know, the ego and the id. I mean, it's like you can have answers to this.
Yeah.
A lot of times the humanistic answer is some version of the soul, although they quail at using that word.
Oh yeah, but ultimately it's the same potentially wild goose chase.
Yeah, it's a blessed humanity, even if it's severed from a religious notion.
Yeah, you said it was here. I'm at some point I'm gonna need you to point to it. Because if it's not out in the world,
right, then it's somewhere in the skin bag.
Yeah, because we can actually point to stuff anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at my revision notes here, and it seems like that's kind of, it says, you know, the different media suggest attention to the taskscape. Commenting on the audio is being aware of the task rather than the content.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, that's one way to stitch these together is the fact that, you know, so, and this is methodological, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, why did you set up the experiment the way you did? Well, we had those 4 different media because that aligns with the notion of the taskscape. And then ultimately, the results we saw in terms of like, I can't quite hear it. So this is what I think it says, right?
Yeah.
And how that calls attention to the respondent's awareness of being within a taskscape, I suppose, you know, not explicit, but implicit knowledge of being within a taskscape.
Yeah, I like that.
There were a couple of notes here. Also our treatment of why readability and not trauma.
Yeah.
It says we don't want to, or we didn't want to cultivate a taskscape in which trauma reemerges. The hits cause readability, so we don't want to cause trauma.
Yes.
Because, you know, we do have the methods, I think, starts with like a statement of 2 things popped out of the first one, right? Readability and trauma. Here's why we're not doing trauma. Yes. But that statement isn't in taskscape terms.
Yes.
I think right now it's just sort of in terms of like, there's no way we can wade into those waters, I think.
Yeah.
Let me see here. Yeah, 2 principal components. In the current study, we've opted to explore readability further, but not trauma due to the sensitivities surrounding treating it as a commercial or scholarly topic, especially when engaged in human subjects. I mean, so this is all good material. Yeah. I don't think it needs to go, but no. I think it can more explicitly tie to, in fact, this would probably be, I would think, the general point, and then the specific point is we're viewing this as a taskscape which invokes these things, right? I mean, we're cultivating readability. We don't want to, within a task, we don't want to create a taskscape that cultivates trauma.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's just an augmentation of this statement rather than a replacement of it. It's just, you know, quite literally what we want to do is cultivate this thing, so we're not doing that with trauma.
Yeah.
Let's see what else here. Excise the Ulmer base unit frame, which we did, and instead put the work in the context of the rhetorical situation, starting with Bitzer and Vatz and Cassini and moving forward from there. This allows us, and this might be some conclusion stuff, this allows us to set up the third product and work in the Hanrahan about the agency of design interface choices. It's all broader elements of the taskscape.
Yeah, that's right. That the notion of that, kind of what I was getting at with at the end of that, right? That little aside, right, about the bleakness is like, well, one of the things that the taskscape does additionally is not just give us kind of research explanatory power, but the taskscape then becomes inventional, right? Like, so if you're thinking about how the taskscape generates certain things, how do you tweak the taskscape?
Yeah. Well, and I think that, as the note suggests, may allow us to introduce the Hanrahan conversation we had, you know.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I don't have to go review that, but I think it kind of came near the end, and that was a good talk. But I think it kind of came near the end where he was like, because, you know, I mean, as he kind of reiterated throughout, he was like, I deal with very kind of, in certain ways, sort of like practical concerns of, it's like, well, how does the interface, facilitate or dissuade, or, you know, in strict terms, allow or prevent certain interactions, right? So, I mean, part of his conversation was sort of about like, it nudged up into like, what's the persuasive agency of, you know, even like the Mechanical Turk interface? Because he quite literally was like, yeah, but what about when you're talking about like the interface you guys used to set these up, or that your respondents used to complete them? Like, what's the agency of, you know, the actual computer programs and services that are staring at you while you're doing this? And we saw that as an interesting offshoot, not one we'd really dealt with, you know?
Well, and that got us excited about the possibility of, you know,
working with him.
Yeah, and further, I mean, and then further things coming out. I mean, it would be really, really great if, you know, pieces written with or by other people.
Yeah.
Part of this Mechanical Turks cult we're finding.
So yeah, I mean, maybe that's something in the conclusion. It would open a door to introducing the Hanrahan and the notion of the different agential elements here, including, I mean, just like, you know, UX or, you know, or UI, right? I mean, which the relationship between those two is still being hashed out, but it's like, no, these are the check boxes that were actually on Mechanical Turk. This is the limits of characters you're allowed to input. Those are doing things.
Yeah.
Those look like the main things I had in my revision notes that are applicable. Other things are like, I need to make clips of Sean and Kegel and hook them up. King might go at the end of the discussion where we address redefining what we are in opposition to what we are not. Dr. Minsu King on the contextualized differences between humans and machines. Quite certain.
Oh yeah, and then I'm going to add taskscape language to this, probably where in the results section when we're talking about meta discourse. It's for us that meta discourse signals at least an implicit awareness of the taskscape.
Right. Yeah, or I mean, it's just evidence that it's there, right?
Yeah. It's
not like it's a secret either they do or don't have in mind. It's like, it's just evidence that it's if not, because, you know, I don't think we want to say it's what's really going on there, but it's a frame that is functional.
Right.
Okay, do we need anything specific about audience targeting? I mean, I can look at this. Yeah, I mean, I have some other things, but they're just kind of like, well, although we might need to, like, should we discuss incentives in terms of exigence, right? Is there any research in rhetoric on monetary exigence?
Oh yeah.
Should we have some research explicating the use of enthymeme? Right now, it's just kind of assumed biological, physiological stuff as enthymeme, like filling in scotomas or audio illusions, the shepherd tone. So what I think the note there means is, you know what those things are. I mean, like, you know, treating things like the shepherd tone, you know, that tone that always sounds like it's going up, even though it's not. Or filling in scotoma. You know, we all have blind spots biologically, but they're filled in by the brain. Is there research in rhetoric treating those as enthymematic, right? Your brain fills in the scotoma. You hear this in the audio or visual illusion.
I like that. The shepherd's tone is a enthymeme.
And see, I don't know if that research exists.
Yeah. Let's email Hans Zimmer. Guys making bank with the shepherd tone.
You know, Kristen C's dissertation was on the enthymeme, but I don't really know what was in it.
Yeah, she did a lot. It was a lot of it on virality.
Do we need anything specific about audience targeting, or can that be assumed? Clarity and fairness in phase one. Okay, this is making more of the data.
Okay.
Methods participating within the platform versus the first products. Oh, a statement in the methods about us participating within the platform rather than the first one's pseudo external observation, right? So if the first one was sort of an arm's length reading of the hit posts, right? I mean, it's collection and automated reading of those. This is participation. I don't know. I mean, can that be framed in terms of?
I did. There's a bit right before we talk about the IRB. I said to sound the taskscape that is in Turks, we entered into it. We did so by soliciting Turker labor and feedback through posted hits. Taskscapes are not discrete spheres of action, but rather ongoing concerns. It's only from within a taskscape that a taskscape can be sensed. One has to be embedded, as Ingold describes. So I probably need to do a little more lead, but basically, right, that by virtue, given that the taskscape is a kind of movement, you have to be in the taskscape to know the taskscape. It can't really be known externally.
But I might just put just literally a few words contrasting this with the first one.
Yeah.
In turn, methodologically, right? I mean, since these are all kind of conscious of each other as an ongoing thing, you know, a connection with that first one again, just by saying, you know, we did this methodologically. It literally would probably be a few words to a sentence, you know, in contrast to the first one's more discrete reading of extant, you know, hit posts here. In order to sound it out, we need to be within it or whatever.
Yeah.
Or within it in these ways.
I might even start using that language of participated, because that comes back when we talk about the rhetorical situation.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a comment to myself here that just says, as usual, the conclusion is rough. That's helpful. It's correct. Yeah. It's just not.
Oh yeah. No, I always love little notes I leave for myself that just say, fix this.
Right. It's correct.
You're not wrong, Walter.
But I think also, it can be, I think I get what it's saying there, because the conclusion is brief and not great at pointing a direction. I mean, I think there are ways to fix that. That comment may be alleviated by other things that would lead to changing the conclusion anyway.
Yeah. Okay, add that. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to do a brief at the end of the discussion section, at least now, is do a quick, right, this peeling off of Clark in particular, also because Rickert works with Clark in that piece on ambience, and kind of do a little survey there. And then maybe in the conclusion, maybe even start the conclusion by going back to the beginning of that, right? So the discussion section kind of concludes with placing this in the context of the rhetorical situation, starting with Bitzer and then working chronologically forward in some fashion. But then the beginning of the conclusion section, going back to Bitzer as a kind of, right, but we want to link back up to Bitzer and then, right, but in light of the development of this conversation.
Right.
Bitzer helps potentially sets up that cultural techniques conversation, right? Which is that these non-human media come to shape conceptual concerns.
Yeah.
But just not with the kind of philosophical baggage that Bitzer brings to it.
Yeah, or with, you know, the addition of critical insights since him.
Yeah.
With the addition of the kind of new materialism stuff that Rickert and others have forwarded, it allows us to, you know, reinterpret Bitzer in ways that are productive now. I mean, I think what I might do, I'm going to take a look at these notes I have. I don't think I'll let you have access to them, but what I don't want to do is like change stuff that you are in the process of changing. So what I might do is take a look at some of these elements that are more kind of discrete. So a good example is I might research enthymeme to see if some of these things are covered, particularly things like, you know, are there readings of biology enthymematically? Right? You know, is visual or auditory within rhetoric, is visual or auditory illusion framed as enthymematic? I mean, it is outside of rhetoric because, you know, there are a lot of those illusions in a very kind of colloquial way. I just saw one the other day, you know, where it's like, look at this picture. If you see the old man, this is the kind of person you are. Whereas if you see the young woman, this is the kind of person you are, you know, total armchair psychology bullshit. But, you know, I mean, what's simmering underneath that is, well, yeah, something either culturally or biologically or whatever is brought to bear on this thing. And it frames how you see it. You know, one of my favorite examples are those ones where it's a garbled voice and then you see a written text, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I can hear that. But then if you see a different sentence, it's like, oh yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
You know, the written text really primes you for your seemingly biological experience, you know?
Yeah.
So that stuff exists. I don't know if it exists, if people have talked about it in terms of enthymeme, you know?
Yeah.
And I certainly don't want to, well, what I don't want to do, yeah, because it's the study's findings identify ways that readability emerges on MTurk through hybrid human and non-human reciprocity, including meta discourse, enthymeme, audience targeting. I mean, we do talk about these things as results.
Yeah.
So, I mean, ideally, there will be commentary about enthymeme that's applicable. If not, if it would make sense to have a version of what I just said, right? I mean, it's like this stuff exists in other fields. It's seemingly not it's not discussed in our field through something like enthymeme, even though that seems like a useful concept.
Yeah. Well, and it would fit within the kind of larger umbrella of the taskscape, because it's trying to avoid the kind of binary between culture and technique, or culture and technology, or right. So the idea that you could read this enthymematically suggests there's not a reduction to be had there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just need to take a look at those. So I might take a look at some of these things. As I said, like, I don't want to be changing the puzzle as you're kind of putting in pieces. Should incentives this? Yeah, I can look up that as well.
Yeah,
What might be? What's that?
Well, because all those get brought into play, right? The idea of incentives aren't external to readability.
Yeah.
But in part compose what readability is within this taskscape, because incentives are one of the components of it. So I mean, really, it's to go back to our ongoing conversation, right? So looking at incentives, looking at research into enthymemes is just how big of a circle do we want to draw?
Right.
They're all fair game, but how many of these do we want to gesture towards, and how many do we want to at least begin unpacking?
Yeah.
Is it enough at this stage? Because, for instance, right, that question of incentives could be something that we talk about in the third product, right? If we go into the cultural techniques and we start looking at the relationship between something like Turks and Fiverr, or right, then maybe incentives are the move we make in the third one is, for instance, the ways that incentives were revealed as important to the composition of readability in the second product. We want to look at similar platforms where monetary incentives are a primary, an important part of the taskscape.
Yeah.
Because the primary gesture of this second piece is to point out that whatever readability is can't be understood separately from the taskscape. And in Mechanical Turks, as our method and results, right, that we even tweaked incentives as part of the taskscape. So
right, that's true.
So we don't necessarily need to unpack it, because we've just put it on the map as a component that we might very well come back to in the second, because so much of the cultural technique stuff that we even explored at the very beginning, right, is linked to issues of labor and markets and Turkers, right? The ways in which Turkers are very sensitive around issues of right, they're keenly aware of monetary incentives, and also keenly aware of what that means for the taskscape itself, right? I mean, so there's a way of reading, right, the way that Turkers don't necessarily want to organize, is a kind of recognition that if the incentives go away, the taskscape just unravels.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what the Hanrahan piece was, in some ways looking at that as, the labor market aspect of that. Well, and in fact, other work he had done was more explicitly attuned even to labor market forces,
Yeah.
the ways in which participants protect it or foster it, even in ways that I think a lot of us would say, you don't realize that you're damaging yourself.
Yeah. But it's part of that. I mean, I think we linked that, right? And maybe that's the spot to do it, right? That meta discourse around the difficulty of the task, I mean, without being able to kind of demonstrate it. I think we discussed this maybe last time or a few times before, that meta discourse is in a sense motivated by the incentive structure of Mechanical Turks, right? That because they're incentivized to successfully complete these tasks, that makes readability something that happens at several levels simultaneously, which is they're trying to read the audio, but they're also reading how readable the audio is. And that's because they're in a taskscape, which makes that readability important at both levels.
Yeah.
Because if they can't create discernible summaries and they're worried about not getting compensated for their inability to do that, then that makes them hyper aware, right? That means that they're also then reading the quality of the task that's shaping the quality of their task, which we looked at with the first product, right? When someone suggested that we're probably looking at a lot of really bad hits that aren't getting taken up. Well, that's not unimportant to us, because ignored tasks also helps us think about how readability is working.
Yeah. Those things have their a place,
Yeah.
on the platform as well.
That a good Turker is always doing I mean, right, there's now a way in which, successful Turkers have to get really good at assessing the method of the hits that they're, right? So that all these successful Turkers are now, essentially doing kind of IRB work for all of the hits they look at, right?
Or triage.
Yeah, triage is probably a much better word, right? Which is, again, like, that's a form of readability generated within the taskscape. What we would think of as the uniquely human ability to read and assess the situation at a kind of meta level is itself still embedded in this taskscape, right? Through their participation in the taskscape of Mechanical Turks, they become able to read Mechanical Turks as a taskscape. But that's not a move out of Mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
That's a function of being in Mechanical Turks.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think we can just continue to revise. There briefly, let me share my screen here.
Yeah.
I'm constantly getting different, mostly news articles that are potentially applicable. I don't know the degree to which these will show up, but some of them may or may not be useful. This popped up on Ars Technica, and it's pointing to some other things, but it does speak to something that we cover in the second product, which is the potential, right? The discussion of the stochastic parrot, the idea of fluent speech not being identical to fluent thought.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting split because sorry, I've got a pop-up here I don't want to deal with. it speaks to, well, it's the same kind of conversation you have with, it spun out of the recent one about I think it was a Google engineer who thought the AI was a person, right? This was in the news recently. And of course it blew up because supposedly he was fired for this, as though there's a big cover up.
Yeah.
Possibly, although it's also possible that it was just a much more mundane. He violated an NDA by disclosing something he was working on. And of course has been subsequently dumped on. It's like, no, it's not conscious. This guy doesn't understand what consciousness means. But I mean, these are often interesting because, like, well, what is the difference between fluent speech and fluent thought?
Yeah, you tell me. I mean, yeah.
And, it often boils down to, pseudo-mystical notions, even though people reject that, it's still something supernatural. It comes down to, well, it's not that, right? I don't know what it is, but I know it's not that. So there was some news about that, about, if there is a distinction between fluent speech and thought, what is it? And if so, is that meaningful? Because some of this other stuff is about, kind of the long-standing, we don't really want artificial intelligence because that's always been there. What we really want is a black mirror. We want to see ourselves in the computer. And it's, there's this continual reinscription, this continual no true Scotsman, where it's like, well, now computers can do that. Well, but that's not, but that doesn't count anymore then,
Oh yeah. I mean, this is just a everyday enactment of Kang's thesis.
Yeah. Right.
Like it just being played out in Slashdot is this constant redrawing of the whatever the human is, it's reactionary.
Yeah. Anyway, so there were a couple other things like this I thought was maybe, and the reason why I'm on Slashdot here is because it's pointing to a bunch of other potential resources. But this notion of, right, it says, it asks, what will language be like in a future human machine era, which we're already in? I guess this is a future human machine era. That's where the emphasis is. Because the idea, as we talked about in the first product, was, this kind of pigeon of ways that humans and machines are growing together, right? I mean, one thing we looked at in the beginning is readability as growing from sort of both sides. Human language becoming more machinic language becoming more human, the role of handwriting and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea is language is not really like, well, this is a human thing and it's being impinged upon by machines, right? It's like, well, we have to change the way we talk to suit them. But, that's not necessarily the best way to view this, where it's like, language is something in which we participate, but we are not the only participants.
Yeah.
And that's not a novel hypothesis. I mean, the entire premise of things like the meme hinges on this idea of language having a kind of autonomy. It's not just this thing that humans made. It's a kind of uncontrollable entity. So, there are things like this that are asking these sorts of questions, right? What will language be like in a future human machine era? I mean, first off, we're already in this era. So,
right. I mean, it's again, right. It depends on what you've defined as machine.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and where's the emphasis here? Is it the qualifier future?
Right.
I mean, or can you get rid of human machine and just say, what will language be like in a future era? Because we can just accept that machines are participating in that.
Right.
And then there are kind of related stuff here, like in this magazine, The Internet is Made of Demons. Kind of underpinning this is this notion of Are we changing ourselves to suit machines? This is kind of the other aspect of that, right? It says AI software can ace IQ tests, can better tests help ascertain what AI is doing. I mean, these are all parts of this larger conversation about our relationships.
Yeah.
And for our purposes, you know, to get a handle on this, how that manifests in language, right? This idea of what's language going to look like in the human machine era. As rhetoricians, it's like, I think we should be talking about that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we frame that question a little bit differently because it's like, well, that era isn't coming.
Right.
But I mean, I think that's largely what our work is looking at, is like, what's the role of language? Or not the role, but I mean, what's language's place in this? How do these things appear in language? Anywho, so there are news items that may or may not be pertinent.
Hold on. I actually, as you're talking, I'm going to share my screen. A news item just came in. It was shared by a former student who's was an English and computer science double major, and he's now studying VR, AR stuff in grad school. But he sent me this. See if I can turn this audio on.
Had the satisfaction of seeing helped to describe the fortunes of the King of Exeter, who had the satisfaction of seeing the foe put to flight.
That's
There's a
looping.
neural net for generating speech. It starts with a random noise and iteratively denoises, essentially hallucinating a voice in the noise. Listen to the voice emerge as the number of iterations increase with time.
What's it using as? I mean, I'd have to look, but I mean, it must be some machine learning thing. Holy cow, do you have a lot of, not tabs, but those bookmarks?
Oh, I bookmark, baby.
Whoa, is that functional?
Yeah.
You can look at those and.
Yep. These are all my course sites. I give them all icons. Don't you worry about it, buddy.
You know, I use nested lists. I use outline. I'm an outliner.
You are an outliner.
So I have, you know, drop downs of, you know, courses and then subsets. Anyway, I'd be interested to see how that voice was generated, because I mean, is it being compared against some notion of this is, it is, you know, this is what the correct thing is, and we want you, you know, it's probably machine learned, to get closer to this or whatever. Anyway.
Huh.
Well, so
yeah.
Before we get too far afield, yeah, I mean, let's just think of in terms of concrete changes to this product.
Yeah.
And I mean, we can kind of see what happens with the conclusion. We might write the conclusion last.
Yeah. I think I'm going to,
based on, you know, what the other sections do,
flesh out the rhetorical situation stuff in the discussion. I'm going to layer in the Taskgate stuff into the other sections. You've already marked some spots where it's applicable. So there's at least 2 spots in the methods section where I'm going to build that in. There's one part in the results section about the meta discourse that I think is amenable to some Taskgate stuff. Yeah, and then we'll see. My instinct now is just as a smooth transition is to figure out a way to kind of end the discussion section with that rhetorical situation and then start the conclusion at the kind of beginning of that rhetorical, like just go to Bitzer, but then work outwards from it's like a kind of reinterpreted, reread Bitzer, puts these things into play, and some of those will get picked up in the next product.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm usually a big fan of writing from the middle, of doing those middle parts and then doing the intro and conclusion afterward, because then you just have a much better handle on what, you know, in the intro, what you're setting up, and in your conclusion, where you're going from here. All right. I guess that's the gist of it.
Yeah. Back at it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually next week, I'm starting a summer grad course on digital field methods. And I'm going to actually be talking about this project as a kind of example. So I'm going to be
Makes sense.
back in the thick of it. So
Good.
um,
I've been writing a chapter over the summer, the one that's on synthetic meat products.
nice. Yeah. I'm embarking on there's an edited collection that's on ecology and feelings, and I got asked to write about apathy. So I'm writing a chapter now that's about what if we just didn't care about the environment as an environmental rhetoric.
No, we're gonna find out. No,
Yeah,
right now it's not that we don't care; it's that we're aggressive toward it.
Yeah.
We're exploiting it consciously. Now, if it's about apathy, of course, obviously, the chapter you should turn in should just say whatever and just say that's it.
Yeah. So I just did another one just on apathy, which is why I got asked to do this. So
Kind of contradictory.
Yeah, I care too much about apathy. Well, what's interesting about it is it was a key terms collection about the alpha privative. So the little A that goes in front of stuff like apathy. And it's not the same as antipathy. So the alpha privative is like a negation that still keeps the thing present. Mm-hmm. So antipathy is not caring. Apathy is sort of like not caring.
Mm. Right. Yeah, we see that. And lots of other permutations, asexual, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anywho.
All right.
Synthetic meat and apathy. That seems par for the course with us.
Yeah, this is.
You're looking at Cinco products for synthesized meat.
This is it's one of the chapters. You know, the previous one that I did was the Soylent Juicero one. This is another chapter. So this is an interesting one. This is also where I brought up in this talk that I gave a early version of this through a talk in order to work it out. What talks are actually supposed to be used for. Yeah. In theory, that had the fly and Swamp Thing. I think I can hold on to the fly. Swamp Thing, I think, is going to go. Oh. But I think I'll be able to hold on to the fly, in part because that seemed to be the part that people were most interested in. One of those things where it's like, I'm not exactly sure it's the best fit, but people are like, yeah, that's the only thing I care about. And I was like, oh, all right.
You got to give the people what they want.
I guess, until a reviewer is like, you can't have that in here anymore.
You just got to hope you get some Jeff Goldblum stands.
Well, but isn't everybody? I mean, that's a pretty fat target.
That's true. Yeah. Whereas Swamp Thing that's pretty niche.
Geez, you don't hear a lot of hate for Jeff Gold. He's broadly acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we're waiting for the shoe to drop, but.
Right. Yeah. All right.
Okay, well,
we'll see what happens in 2 weeks. We'll see.
Yeah, now we've just cursed Jeff Goldblum, so it's probably time to push this giant ball of oil out the window.
We've jinxed him. Something's going to happen in the next 2 weeks.
Okay, well, let's get to work on this.
Yeah, I'll see you for
All right, bye, Jeremy.